Blood and bleached bones littered the Sonora stagecoach route, a grim testament to 5 years of undisputed terror. Emerson Blackwood and his ruthless outfit ruled this sun-scorched wasteland, bleeding it dry of every ounce of silver and gold. Lawmen vanished into the shifting sands, and bounty hunters simply became food for the buzzards. Protected by a needle-thread escape route called Cutter's Pass, these outlaws believed they were untouchable gods of the alkali. Every empire, however, inevitably faces its ruin. For Blackwood's gang, doom didn't arrive wearing a federal tin star or riding with the cavalry. Doom was a nameless stranger, a worn Winchester rifle, and a dead-end gorge they foolishly believed they owned. The Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1882, was not a place for merciful men. It was an anvil where the sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, forging survivors and burning away the weak. In this brutal expanse, no one thrived quite like the Blackwood gang. They were not a ragtag group of desperate drifters. Under the command of Emerson Blackwood, they operated with the lethal precision of a military unit. Emerson was a former Confederate sharpshooter from Missouri, a man whose eyes were as flat and dead as riverbed stones. He didn't rob for the thrill of the chase. He robbed because he viewed the frontier as an open vault waiting for a man with the iron will to pry it open. His right hand was Josiah Boone, a hulking brute of a man with a scarred jaw and an affinity for close-quarters brutality. Where Emerson was cold and calculating, Josiah was a powder keg, kept in check only by his absolute loyalty to Blackwood. Rounding out the core of their outfit were Billy Caldwell, a hot-headed kid from Texas with a fast draw and a reckless streak, and Elias Trent, a quiet, older man who served as the gang's farrier, medic, and explosives expert. Their dominion was the stretch of road between Tucson and the Mexican border. It was a vital artery for silver, payrolls, and mail, and the Blackwood gang held it hostage. Wells Fargo had doubled, then tripled the guards on their stagecoaches. Pinkerton detectives had been contracted to hunt them down. It didn't matter. The gang knew the topography of the desert better than the indigenous wildlife. They struck like lightning, leaving behind burning wreckage and bodies, and vanished into the rocky crags before the dust had even settled. Their secret, the reason they had survived half a decade of massive bounties on their heads, was Cutter's Pass. Cutter's Pass was a geological anomaly, a violent tear in the earth that cut through an impassable mountain range. It was a mile-long gorge, flanked by towering, sheer sandstone cliffs that scraped the sky. At its widest, it allowed 2 horses to ride abreast. At its narrowest, a rider had to pull his boots from the stirrups to avoid scraping the stone. It was the ultimate bottleneck. If the gang was pursued, they simply rode into the pass. A single man with a rifle positioned in the rocks above the entrance could hold off an army of 50. Once the gang traversed the mile-long canyon, they emerged into the lawless expanse of northern Mexico, effectively vanishing from the jurisdiction of American lawmen. Cutter's Pass was their back door, their sanctuary, and their greatest weapon. For weeks, Emerson had been meticulously planning their magnum opus. The territorial governor was moving a massive payroll, $30,000 in gold eagle coins, destined for the garrison at Fort Huachuca. It was meant to be a secret, transported in a heavily reinforced mud wagon rather than a standard Concord stagecoach, escorted by 4 hand-picked outriders. But in the West, gold always possessed a loud voice, and a whisper had reached Emerson's ears. Sitting by the dying embers of a campfire the night before the strike, Emerson laid it out. "We hit them at Dry Creek Crossing," he instructed, his voice barely above a whisper, yet commanding absolute silence from his men. "The wagon will slow down in the loose sand. Josiah, you take the driver and the shotgun messenger. Billy, Elias, you drop the outriders. We don't ask for a surrender. We don't give them a chance to draw. We take the gold, we ride hard south for 3 hours, and we slip through Cutter's Pass before word even reaches Tucson." Josiah spat a stream of tobacco into the dust, grinning. 30,000. We could buy half of Sonora with that, Emerson. We aren't buying anything until we are on the other side of that rock, Emerson replied, his eyes narrowing. Get your sleep. Tomorrow we bleed them." The mid-morning sun was already baking the earth when the mud wagon lumbered toward the dry creek crossing. The heavy wooden wheels ground through the arid soil, kicking up a massive plume of white dust. The four outriders rode with their Winchesters resting across their pommels, their heads swiveling constantly. They were seasoned men, veterans of the frontier, but they were riding into a trap designed by a master. Emerson and his men were dug into the steep embankments overlooking the dry riverbed, completely camouflaged by mesquite and sagebrush. They had been waiting since dawn, perfectly still, baking in the relentless heat as the wagon's front wheels hit the deep, loose sand of the creek bed. The mules strained and slowed. The vehicle groaned, its pace dropping to a crawl. Emerson sighted down the long barrel of his Sharps rifle. He exhaled a slow, controlled breath, centering the iron sights on the chest of the lead outrider. He squeezed the trigger. The boom of the heavy buffalo rifle shattered the desert silence like a thunderclap. Before the lead outrider even registered the sound, he was thrown from his saddle, dead before he hit the dirt. Chaos erupted. Josiah unleashed a barrage of fire from his repeating rifle, tearing through the driver's box of the wagon. The driver slumped forward, dropping the reins, while the shotgun messenger returned blind fire into the brush before being cut down by Billy Caldwell's twin Colt revolvers. The remaining outriders fought valiantly, their horses screaming and rearing in the crossfire. One of them managed to unholster his sidearm and fire a wild shot into the brush, grazing Elias Trent's shoulder. Elias grunted, ignoring the blood seeping into his canvas shirt, and returned fire, dropping the man. Within 60 seconds it was over. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the panicked snorting of the mule team. The Blackwood gang descended from the embankments like vultures. Josiah hauled the strongbox from the rear of the wagon. It was heavy, reinforced with iron bands, and sealed with a heavy padlock. Elias stepped forward, pulling a small, tightly wrapped charge of dynamite from his satchel. He set it against the lock, lit the short fuse, and stepped back. The explosion blew the lock to shrapnel and popped the lid of the box open. Inside, canvas sacks sat heavy and tight. Emerson pulled a knife, slicing one open. The unmistakable, heavy glint of gold eagles spilled into the harsh sunlight. "Load it," Emerson commanded, his face betraying no emotion. "Saddlebags, evenly distributed. Leave the silver. It's too heavy for a fast ride." "Elias is bleeding," Billy pointed out, nervously watching the horizon. "It's a scratch," Elias muttered, wrapping a bandana tightly around his bicep. "I can ride." "Then we ride," Emerson said, mounting his dark bay gelding. "We have 3 hours before anyone stumbles onto this mess. By sunset, we'll be drinking tequila in Mexico." They rode hard, pushing their horses to the absolute limit. The desert blurred past them, an endless sea of saguaro cacti and cracked earth. The gold was heavy, but the adrenaline fueled them. They felt invincible. They had just pulled off the largest heist in the territory's history, and they had executed it flawlessly. As the afternoon dragged on, the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the sand. The air cooled slightly. Ahead of them, rising like a jagged wall against the painted sky, was the mountain range. And right in the center, a dark, narrow slit in the rock cutter's pass. "We're clear!" Josiah roared over the thunder of hooves, slapping his horse's flank. "Ain't nobody behind us." Emerson allowed a thin ghost of a smile to touch his lips. They had won. The desert road belonged to them, and they were about to walk through the back door into early retirement. They slowed their horses to a trot as they approached the towering sandstone cliffs that marked the entrance to the pass. But as the shadows deepened at the mouth of the canyon, Emerson pulled sharply on his reins, bringing his horse to an abrupt halt. The others piled up behind him, confused. "What is it?" Billy asked, wiping a layer of sweat and grit from his forehead. Emerson didn't answer. He just stared straight ahead into the gloom of the canyon entrance. Cutter's Pass was a chute of solid stone. There was no brush, no cover, just a sandy floor trapped between vertical walls. And sitting dead center in the middle of that sandy floor, blocking the only way forward, was a man. He sat on a weathered wooden crate, entirely motionless. He was draped in a long, dust-caked duster coat that had seen too many miles. A wide-brimmed Stetson was pulled low over his eyes, casting his face in dark shadow. A hand-rolled cigarette hung loosely from the corner of his mouth, the tip glowing faintly orange in the fading light. Resting casually across his thighs was a Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle. He didn't have a horse tied nearby. He didn't have a posse flanking him. He was completely, utterly alone. Josiah let out a harsh bark of laughter. "What the hell is this? Some dirt farmer got lost?" Emerson held up a hand, silencing him. His instincts, honed by years of bloody survival, were screaming at him. The man wasn't lost. The crate he was sitting on had bold black stenciling on the side. "Danger, Hercules Powder Co." He was sitting on a box of mining dynamite. "Keep your hands away from your irons," Emerson warned his men in a low, tight voice. He spurred his horse forward at a slow walk, closing the distance until he was 20 yards from the seated figure. "Evening, friend," Emerson called out, his voice echoing slightly off the high canyon walls. The man didn't move. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling a thin stream of blue smoke that hung in the still air. "You're blocking the road," Emerson continued, adopting a tone of dangerous patience. "This is a bad place to stop for a rest. We need to pass." "Road's closed," the man said. His voice was gravelly, quiet, but carrying perfectly in the confined space. It wasn't a voice filled with fear, nor was it puffed up with bravado. It was simply stating a fact, like remarking on the weather. Emerson's eyes narrowed. "I don't think you understand the situation, mister. There are 4 of us. You are sitting alone on a crate of explosives in a canyon we own. Now, I am in a generous mood today. Pick up your rifle by the barrel, walk out of this canyon, and you can keep your life." The nameless man finally tilted his head up. Beneath the brim of the hat, his eyes locked onto Emerson. They were cold, empty, and devoid of any human warmth. He didn't look at the other 3 men. He didn't look at the gold bulging in their saddlebags. He just looked at Emerson. "Name's Emerson Blackwood," the man said, stating it not as a question, but as a verdict. "That's Josiah Boone, Elias Trent, Billy Caldwell. Warrants in 3 territories. Murder, stage robbery, theft of federal property." Billy Caldwell, always the hothead, spurred his horse forward, his hand hovering over his right hip. "Who the hell do you think you are, Badge? You ain't wearing tin. You want to die for a bounty?" "Not a bounty hunter," the man said smoothly. He reached out and tapped the ash from his cigarette onto the sand. "Then get out of the damn way," Billy yelled, losing his patience. His hand dropped to his holster, fingers curling around the grip of his Colt. It happened with a speed that defied the naked eye. The nameless man didn't stand up. He didn't even drop his cigarette. His right hand snapped the Winchester up from his lap, cocking the lever and pulling the trigger in one fluid, instantaneous motion. Crack. The rifle shot echoed like a cannon blast in the narrow rock walls. Billy Caldwell jerked backward in his saddle, a perfect red circle appearing dead center in his forehead. He hung there for a split second before gravity took over, dumping him off the side of his horse into the dirt with a heavy thud. The horses screamed and danced. Josiah reached for his rifle, but Emerson yelled, "Hold!" The nameless man had already worked the lever again. The Winchester was now pointed directly at the chest of the crate of dynamite beneath him. "You shoot me," the man said softly, the echo of the gunshot still ringing in their ears. "I drop this barrel. The bullet, or the fall, sets off the percussion caps in this crate. We all turn into a red mist, and this canyon collapses, burying you and your stolen gold under 10,000 tons of sandstone." Emerson stared at the man, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. He looked at Billy's lifeless body in the dirt. The kid hadn't even cleared leather. This wasn't a lawman making an arrest. This wasn't a bounty hunter looking for a payday. This was a man who had come to Cutter's Pass to die, and he was absolutely intent on taking the Blackwood gang to hell with him. "Who are you?" Emerson demanded, his voice cracking for the first time in 5 years. The man took a final drag of his cigarette, flicked the butt into the dirt, and shifted his finger onto the trigger of the Winchester. "I'm the toll collector," he whispered, "and you boys are in heavy arrears." The echo of the gunshot took a long time to die in Cutter's Pass. It bounced off the towering sandstone walls, a fading drumbeat that left behind a suffocating silence. The smell of burnt powder, sharp and acidic, drifted on the stagnant canyon air, mingling with the copper scent of Billy Caldwell's blood, soaking into the alkali dust. Emerson Blackwood did not look at his dead companion. His flat, dead eyes remained locked on the nameless man sitting on the crate of Hercules dynamite. The man hadn't shifted his posture. The lever of his Winchester was racked, the hammer back, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. The barrel was pointed squarely at the wooden crate beneath him. "You're a madman," Josiah hissed, his horse prancing nervously side to side. The hulking brute's face was purple with rage, his hand white-knuckling the reins to keep from reaching for his iron. "You'll blow yourself to kingdom come just to stop us?" "I've got nowhere else to be," the toll collector replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried perfectly in the acoustics of the gorge. "But you boys, you've got a pressing engagement in Sonora, and an army of Pinkertons and angry marshals about 3 hours behind you." Emerson raised a hand, signaling Josiah to keep quiet. His mind was racing, calculating angles, trajectories, and probabilities. He glanced at Elias Trent. The older man was pale, swaying slightly in the saddle. The bullet graze on his shoulder was bleeding more heavily now, staining his canvas duster a dark, wet crimson. "Elias," Emerson muttered out of the corner of his mouth. "The crate. Is he bluffing?" Elias squinted through the haze of pain and the lengthening shadows of the canyon. "Standard 50-pound shipping crate," he whispered back, his voice strained. "Hercules powder, nitroglycerin base. If that box is full and he shoots it, or if he just falls backward and tips it over onto those rocks, the concussion will bring down the canyon walls. It'll bury us under 100 feet of rubble. Can you drop him before he pulls the trigger?" "Not from horseback. Not with a handgun. He's got his finger inside the guard. Muscle spasm alone will set the gun off if I shoot him dead." Emerson turned his attention back to the stranger. "All right, friend," he called out, his voice smooth, betraying none of the cold panic gnawing at his gut. "You've made your point. You want the gold. 30,000 in Eagle coins. It's yours. We drop the saddlebags, we ride past you, and you can live like a king in San Francisco." The stranger reached up with his left hand and slowly pushed the brim of his Stetson up a fraction of an inch. For the first time, Emerson could see his eyes clearly. They were pale, washed-out blue, like the sky over a winter prairie. They were the eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss so long that the abyss had moved in. "I don't want the gold, Emerson," the man said. "Then what the hell do you want?" Josiah roared, unable to contain himself. "You ain't a lawman. You don't want the money. What's your play?" 3 years ago, the nameless man began, his tone conversational, as if he were recounting a story around a campfire rather than holding 3 men at gunpoint. "A bank in Prescott, the First National. You boys hit it on a Tuesday morning. The vault was on a time lock, so you took what was in the teller cages." Emerson stiffened. He remembered Prescott perfectly. It had been a messy job. There was a clerk working the front desk, the stranger continued. Name of Phoenix Penhaligon. Just a boy, really. 19 years old. Newlywed. He didn't reach for a gun. He was just trying to get the keys out of his pocket to open the lockbox for you. But you, Josiah, you got impatient. Josiah's scarred jaw tightened. Kid moved too fast. I didn't have time to ask his intentions. You put a shotgun slug through his chest, the toll collector said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, growing colder. And then, as you were riding out of town, You threw a stick of dynamite into the general store to cover your tracks. An old man named Ezekiel Miller lost both his legs in the blast. He bled out in the street while you rode south. Collateral, Emerson said flatly. It's the nature of the frontier. If you're kin to Phoenix or Ezekiel, I understand your grievance. But you can't bring them back, and you can't spend vengeance. Take the gold. You misunderstand me, Emerson, the man said softly. I'm not their kin. I didn't even know them. The silence returned, heavier this time. Emerson felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine. Then who are you? I told you, the man said, lowering his rifle just an inch, shifting the barrel from the crate to aim directly at Josiah's broad chest. I'm the toll collector, and the toll for Cutter's Pass isn't gold. It's blood. The sun finally dipped below the high western rim of the canyon, plunging Cutter's Pass into deep blue twilight. The temperature began to plummet rapidly, the desert surrendering its heat to the approaching night. The wind picked up, whistling mournfully through the narrow stone chute, kicking up devils of alkali dust that stung the eyes. Time was the one thing the Blackwood gang did not have. With every passing minute, the distance between them and the posse hunting the stolen territorial payroll shrank. We can't wait him out, Emerson, Elias groaned, leaning heavily on his saddle horn. His face was the color of old parchment. I'm losing too much blood, and if the cavalry catches us pinned in this canyon, we're at the end of a rope. I know, Emerson murmured. He looked at Josiah. The big man was coiled like a rattlesnake, his eyes darting frantically across the sheer rock walls, looking for a way to flank. There was none. The walls were vertical, polished smooth by millennia of flash floods. Emerson, Josiah whispered, his voice trembling with homicidal energy. I can rush him. I'll take the bullet. You and Elias ride through the smoke while he's working the lever. It was a suicidal plan, but Emerson knew Josiah meant it. The man was terrifyingly loyal. But Emerson also knew that the stranger wasn't aiming to simply kill Josiah. He was aiming to drop the dynamite. If Josiah rushed him, the canyon would come down on all of them. No, Emerson said. We play this my way. Emerson slowly, deliberately raised his hands, keeping them far away from the twin Remington revolvers holstered at his hips. He swung his right leg over the saddle and slid to the ground. What are you doing? Josiah, he said. Showing him a gesture of good faith, Emerson said loudly, ensuring the stranger heard him. He took 2 steps forward, his boots crunching loudly on the gravelly sand. All right, mister. You want blood? You've got Billy's. You want Josiah for the Prescott boy. Let Josiah and Elias ride out. I'll stay here, me and you, one-on-one. The stranger watched him approach, unblinking. The captain going down with his ship? Noble, Emerson, but untrue. You're trying to close the distance so you can draw before I can react. I'm unarmed. Emerson lied smoothly. He had a derringer up his left sleeve, a spring-loaded trick mechanism he had used to cheat death 6 times in riverboat card games. He just needed to get within 10 feet. Stop right there, the toll collector ordered. Emerson was 20 feet away. Emerson stopped. You can't hold all 3 of us. Even if you shoot me, Josiah will ride you down. Josiah won't make it 3 feet, the man said. Without warning, Elias Trent let out a ragged scream. Desperation had finally overridden his common sense. He had unholstered his Colt's single action under the cover of his long duster, aiming not at the stranger, but at the ground halfway between them, hoping to kick up enough dust and rock shrapnel to blind the man for a split second. Elias fired. The bullet struck a flat stone, sending a spray of sharp granite into the air. But the stranger didn't flinch. His reaction was terrifyingly mechanical. He didn't aim. He simply pointed and fired. Crack. The Winchester spat flame in the twilight. The bullet didn't hit Elias. It hit the massive, heavy-set draft horse Elias was riding, striking the animal perfectly behind the ear. The beast dropped like a stone, 2,000 pounds of dead weight collapsing instantly. Elias, weak from blood loss, couldn't clear the stirrups in time. The horse fell on his right leg with a sickening crunch of shattering bone. Elias's scream echoed off the canyon walls, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that made even Josiah flinch. "Elias!" Emerson yelled, abandoning his slow approach and diving behind the carcass of Billy Caldwell's horse for cover. Josiah roared in fury, drawing his rifle and unleashing 3 rapid shots. But the twilight and the panic threw off his aim. The bullets sparked harmlessly off the canyon walls 10 feet above the stranger's head. The stranger casually worked the lever of his Winchester, the empty brass casing clinking softly onto the sand. He hadn't moved from the crate of dynamite. "That's 2, the nameless man called out over Elias's whimpering. "Josiah, you're next, but I'm going to make you a deal." Josiah had backed his horse up, using a slight bend in the canyon wall for partial cover. "I'll kill you," he bellowed into the darkness. "I'll skin you alive." "You can try," the voice drifted back, calm and cold. "But here is the deal. I know Elias is your powder man. He told you this crate would bring down the canyon. He was right. But he didn't see the whole picture." Emerson, crouching behind the dead horse, pulled the derringer from his sleeve and gripped it tightly. "What are you talking about?" he yelled. "Look up, Emerson," the stranger commanded. Emerson risked a glance over the horse's flank, peering up at the darkening cliffs towering above them. At first, he saw nothing but shadows. Then, as his eyes adjusted, his blood ran cold. Lining the narrow ridge top, silhouetted against the dark blue sky, were dozens of small, cylindrical shadows. They were wedged into the natural fissures and cracks of the sandstone, running the entire length of the pass behind them, the pass they had just ridden through. "I've been out here for 3 days, Emerson," the toll collector said. "Hercules powder is wonderful stuff, but it's volatile. I ran a line of deck cord from this crate all the way back to the mouth of the pass. You aren't just blocked from going forward into Mexico." A horrifying realization dawned on Emerson Blackwood. The trap wasn't just a barricade, it was a tomb. "If I pull this trigger," the man concluded, "I don't just drop this canyon wall, I drop the whole damn mountain. You can't go forward, and you can't go back." The revelation hung in the frigid desert air, heavier than the gold slung across their saddles. Emerson Blackwood craned his neck, his eyes tracing the faint, ominous lines of debt cord that snaked up the sheer sandstone walls. The Nameless Gunman hadn't just built a roadblock, he had engineered a mausoleum. "You're lying," Josiah spat, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his terror. "You didn't rig a mile of canyon in 3 days. "It took 4, actually," the toll collector replied, his voice drifting through the gloom like a phantom. "I knew Governor Frederick Tritle was moving that payroll a month ago. I knew Jim Hume and his Wells Fargo detectives would push you south. And I knew you'd use Cutter's Pass. You men are brutal, but you are devastatingly predictable." Emerson felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Jim Hume. If the legendary chief detective of Wells Fargo was leading the posse, they wouldn't stop to rest. They would track the mud wagon's blood trail by moonlight. They had maybe an hour before the canyon entrance swarmed with lawmen carrying warrants and repeating rifles. On the ground, Elias Trent let out a pathetic, bubbling groan. His right leg was pinned beneath 2,000 pounds of dead draft horse, the femur shattered into jagged splinters. "Emerson," Elias wheezed, his fingers clawing uselessly at the dirt. "Emerson, you gotta shoot the horse." I can't feel my toes. It's crushing me." "Keep quiet, Elias," Emerson hissed, never taking his eyes off the shadow sitting on the dynamite crate. Emerson's mind, usually a steel trap of logic and strategy, was fracturing. He was a man who played chess while others played checkers, but the stranger had flipped the entire board. "What is the play here, friend?" Emerson asked, keeping his voice steady, projecting a calm he did not possess. "You blow the canyon, you die too. You strike me as a man with a purpose, not a martyr. You didn't orchestrate this grand execution just to bury yourself under a mountain." The stranger reached into his duster and produced a silver pocket watch. He snapped it open, the sharp click echoing off the walls. He didn't look at it. He simply held it in his palm, feeling the ticking of the gears. "Phoenix Penhaligon," the man said softly. "The boy you killed in Prescott. He had a wife. Mary. She was pregnant when you put a slug through his chest." Josiah paced behind the rocks, his boots crunching loudly. "I told you, he moved too fast. It was frontier justice. You draw. You die." "He didn't draw," the stranger corrected, snapping the watch shut. "He was reaching for a key. And Mary lost the baby 2 weeks after she buried him." "The shock," the doctor said. "The grief." "So you're her kin?" Emerson pressed, trying to find an angle, a weakness. "A brother? A father?" "I'm the man who sold Phoenix that pocket watch," the toll collector said. "I own a mercantile in Prescott. Phoenix was a good boy. He swept my floors when he was 12. He was trying to buy a crib. I watched Ezekiel Miller bleed to death on my front porch because of your dynamite. I watched this territory let you ride away because it was too expensive to hunt you." The stranger finally leaned forward, the moonlight catching the hard, angular lines of his face. "You asked what my play is, Emerson. My play is to watch you realize that your money, your guns, and your reputation cannot buy your way out of this canyon. I am going to hold you here until Jim Hume arrives. And when he does, you have a choice. You can surrender and hang in Yuma, or you can draw on me, and I will pull this trigger and bury us all." Emerson stared at the man. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about a traditional shootout. It was about absolute psychological destruction. The stranger wanted them to sit in the freezing dark, listening to Elias slowly die, waiting for the hangman's noose to arrive at their backs. "I ain't hanging," Josiah growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural register. He unhooked the heavy saddlebags from his horse. The canvas sacks of double eagles clinked heavily. "I ain't going to Yuma, and I ain't dying in this ditch." "Josiah, hold your ground," Emerson warned, recognizing the manic glint in the big man's eyes. "He's one man, Emerson." Josiah roared, his sanity finally fracturing under the claustrophobia of the canyon and the ticking clock of the posse. "He's a shopkeeper, a damn merchant." Josiah hefted one of the heavy saddlebags, swinging it like a pendulum. "You want a toll? Here's your damn toll." With a roar of pure animalistic fury, Josiah hurled the bag of gold coins into the dark. It sailed through the air, bursting open against the canyon wall and raining 30 pounds of gold eagles into the sand. And in the same breath, Josiah drew his Colt and charged. Josiah Boone was a terrifying force of nature. Standing 6'4" and built like a slaughterhouse bull, he had survived a dozen close-quarters gunfights through sheer brute resilience. He fired wildly as he sprinted across the open sand, the heavy, .45 caliber slugs sparking off the canyon walls and tearing chunks of wood from the Hercules powder crate. "Josiah, no!" Emerson screamed, flattening himself against the rocks, expecting the deafening roar of the dynamite to consume them all. But the explosion never came. The nameless gunman didn't flinch. He didn't dive for cover. As Josiah's bullets tore through the air around him, the stranger simply tracked the charging giant with the barrel of his Winchester. He didn't shoot Josiah in the chest or the head. He was a man exacting a precise, calculated toll. Crack. The first shot shattered Josiah's right kneecap. The big man's leg collapsed beneath him, as if it had been severed by an invisible scythe. Josiah pitched forward, his face smashing into the alkali dust, his gun firing harmlessly into the earth. He let out a bellow of pain and rage, trying to push himself up with his left arm, his right hand still blindly searching for his dropped revolver. Crack. The second shot tore through Josiah's right shoulder, shattering the collarbone and rendering the arm entirely useless. Josiah collapsed flat onto his stomach, spitting blood and sand. He was 10 feet from the dynamite crate, thrashing like a wounded grizzly bear. "You son of a bitch!" Josiah screamed, his voice tearing his throat. "Kill me! Finish it!" The stranger slowly racked the lever of the Winchester. The empty brass casing arched through the moonlight, landing on a scattered pile of stolen gold eagles. Phoenix took 3 hours to die, the toll collector said, his voice devoid of any triumph or malice. It was merely a recitation of facts. He drowned in his own blood while his wife begged God for a miracle. You have a few hours left, Josiah. I suggest you use them to make your peace. Emerson watched his oldest ally writhing in the dirt. The Blackwood gang, the undisputed kings of the Alkali, had been dismantled in less than 20 minutes by a shopkeeper with a rifle and a death wish. Billy was dead. Elias was pinned and rapidly bleeding out into the sand. Josiah was crippled and screaming. Emerson was alone. The freezing wind howled through the canyon, carrying the distinct, rhythmic thud of distant hoofbeats echoing from the north. The posse, Jim Hume and his men, had found the trail. They were coming. You hear that, Emerson? The stranger asked, shifting his gaze past the bleeding Josiah to where Emerson crouched behind the rocks. That's the sound of the world catching up to you. Emerson looked at his hands. They were trembling. He, Emerson Blackwood, the cold-blooded architect of the territory's most daring robberies, was trembling. He looked at the derringer hidden in his sleeve. It was a fool's weapon now. He looked at the scattered gold, glinting mockingly in the moonlight. It was worthless. Let Elias go, Emerson suddenly shouted, stepping out from behind the rocks, his hands raised, his twin Remington still holstered. He's a dying man. Let me pull him out from under that horse. Let him die with some dignity. The stranger studied Emerson for a long, agonizing moment. Dignity is a luxury you forfeit when you blow the legs off old men, he replied. But I have no quarrel with a dying man's comfort. Move slowly. Emerson walked over to where Elias lay. The older man's face was completely drained of color, his breathing shallow and rapid. Emerson, Elias whispered, his eyes unfocused. It's cold. God, it's so cold. I know, old friend, Emerson said softly. He knelt in the sand, grabbing the heavy leather saddle of the dead draft horse. He strained, his muscles burning, but the beast was too heavy. He couldn't budge it. Emerson leaned down, putting his face close to Elias's ear. I'm sorry, Elias. I can't lift it. The gold, Elias breathed, his voice barely a rattle in his throat. We almost had it. Mexico. Yeah. We almost had it. Emerson lied, stroking the man's matted hair. As Emerson knelt there, feigning comfort, his mind was calculating its final, desperate equation. He was currently 15 feet from the toll collector. Josiah lay between them, groaning in agony. The posse was minutes away. Emerson slowly slid his right hand down Elias's side, his fingers wrapping around the grip of Elias's dropped Colt revolver, hidden from the stranger's view by the dead horse's massive bulk. He didn't have to win a gunfight. He just had to be faster than the stranger's finger on the trigger of the Winchester. If he could put a bullet between the man's eyes before the man could drop the dynamite, the canyon would hold. Emerson could steal the stranger's horse wherever it was hidden and ride out the back of the pass into Mexico alone. Emerson tightened his grip on the hidden Colt. He took a slow, deep breath, visualizing the motion. Up, cock, fire, half a second. He was the fastest draw in the territory. He just had to prove it one last time. I'm going to stand up now, Emerson called out to the stranger, his voice smooth as silk. Take your time, Emerson, the toll collector said. The Winchester remained perfectly level. The posse will be here in 5 minutes. Emerson closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Up, cock, fire. He exploded upward. Emerson Blackwood knelt in the freezing, blood-soaked sand of Cutter's Pass, his right hand buried deep beneath the heavy leather saddle of the dead draft horse. His fingers were wrapped white-knuckle tight around the cross-hatched walnut grip of Elias Trent's discarded Colt single-action revolver. The cold metal of the trigger guard bit into his skin. His breath came in shallow, controlled bursts, creating faint white plumes in the frigid night air. He was 15 feet away from the nameless toll collector, 15 feet of open, moonlit ground. For 5 years, Emerson had survived the unforgiving frontier, not just by being ruthless, but by being the most calculating man in any room canyon, or saloon. He planned for every variable, accounted for every stray bullet, and anticipated every lawman's maneuver. But as he knelt there, listening to the agonizing groans of his crippled men and the distant, rhythmic drumming of an approaching federal posse, he realized his entire empire had been reduced to a crude, desperate fraction of a second. He didn't have to win a prolonged gunfight. He just had to be faster than the stranger's index finger resting on the trigger of the Winchester rifle. If Emerson could put a heavy, .45 caliber lead slug through the center of the man's forehead before a muscle spasm could drop the hammer on the crate of Hercules dynamite beneath him, the canyon would hold. Emerson could steal a horse, abandon his ruined gang, and vanish into the Black Hills of Sonora with his life, if not his stolen gold. "I'm going to stand up now," Emerson called out, his voice smooth, practically vibrating with a false practiced calm. "Take your time, Emerson," the stranger replied from the shadows, his tone steady and entirely devoid of fear. The barrel of his Winchester remained perfectly level, pointed dead center at the wooden explosives crate. "The posse will be here in less than 5 minutes." Emerson closed his eyes for a microscopic fraction of time. He visualized the mechanics of the movement. He had practiced the quick draw thousands of times until it was no longer a conscious thought, but an extension of his own nervous system. Up, cock, fire. Emerson exploded from the dirt. He moved with the sudden, violent kinetic energy of a coiled diamondback striking its prey. He didn't just stand. He lunged sideways to disrupt the stranger's aim, his right arm snapping up from behind the dead horse in a jagged blur of motion. The heavy barrel of the Colt cleared the leather saddle, tracking the dark silhouette sitting on the wooden crate. He didn't use the iron sights. In the dim moonlight, at this range, aiming with the eye was a fatal delay. He aimed with raw instinct, leveling the heavy revolver by feel and muscle memory alone. He squeezed the trigger. The Colt roared. The concussive blast of the gunshot shattered the eerie silence of the canyon, a deafening crack of thunder that physically punched the air out of Emerson's lungs. A massive tongue of yellow and orange flame erupted from the muzzle, momentarily illuminating the narrow stone corridor in a strobe of hellish, violent light. For a split second, the towering sandstone walls, the scattered gold eagles, and the bleeding bodies of his men were cast in stark, terrifying relief. Emerson's boots hit the ground, and he instantly threw his left arm over his face, bracing his body for the end of the world. He had seen what a single stick of nitroglycerin could do to a bank vault. The crate the stranger was sitting on held 50 pounds of the volatile compound. Emerson clamped his eyes shut, every muscle in his body clenching in anticipation of the blinding white flash, the earth-shattering roar, and the horrific, crushing weight of 1,000,000 tons of sandstone collapsing upon his head. He waited for the mountain to come down. He waited to be pulverized into the alkali dust. He waited for death. 1 second passed, then 2. The ringing in Emerson's ears from the gunshot began to fade, replaced only by the mournful whistling of the desert wind. There was no explosion. The ground beneath his boots remained solid and still. Emerson slowly lowered his arm and opened his eyes, blinking through the thick, acrid cloud of gray gun smoke drifting across the canyon floor. Through the haze, he saw that his aim had been true, but slightly off-center. The heavy, .45 caliber slug hadn't caught the stranger in the head. It had struck him high in the left shoulder. The sheer kinetic force of the impact had violently spun the man backward. He tumbled off the wooden crate, his long, dust-caked coat swirling around him like the wings of a falling crow, and hit the hard-packed sand with a heavy, sickening thud. The Winchester rifle clattered uselessly out of his reach, skidding across the dirt. But as the stranger fell, the heel of his heavy riding boot kicked the top edge of the dynamite crate. Emerson gasped, taking a reflexive step backward as the heavy wooden box tipped onto its back 2 corners. It teetered for a terrible, agonizing second, then fell backward, smashing violently against a jagged outcropping of granite jutting from the canyon wall. The aged wood splintered with a sharp crack. The iron hinges snapped, and the lid popped completely off. Emerson braced himself again, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This is it. The impact. But instead of the deafening, catastrophic roar of detonating nitroglycerin, a vastly different sound filled Cutter's Pass. It was a loud metallic clattering, a heavy, unmusical ringing that sounded exactly like a blacksmith's forge being violently overturned. Clank. Clatter. Clank. Emerson lowered the smoking Colt revolver, his mouth falling slightly open. His brain, usually a paragon of cold, calculating logic, stalled completely. He stared at the shattered Hercules powder crate, trying to process the impossible image before him. Spilling out of the broken wooden box, gleaming dully in the pale silver moonlight, were not wax paper sticks of volatile explosives. There were no copper blasting caps. There were no glass vials of unstable nitroglycerin. Spilling across the bloody sand, mixing with the scattered, stolen double eagle gold coins, were dozens of heavy, rusted, cast-iron horseshoes. Emerson stared at the pile of iron, his breathing completely stopped. He looked up at the sheer canyon walls, squinting at the thin, ominous black lines snaking along the rock fissures. The lines the stranger had claimed were lengths of explosive dead cord, wired to bring down the entire mountain. In the shifting moonlight, free from the blinding panic that had gripped him for the last hour, Emerson realized what they really were. They were just lengths of cheap black-tarred hemp rope, carelessly wedged into the cracks to cast long shadows. It was a bluff, an immaculate, terrifying, suicidal bluff. A ragged, wet cough broke the suffocating silence. The nameless man Amos Sterling rolled onto his side, clutching his bleeding left shoulder. He dragged his back up against the cold sandstone wall, panting heavily. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his shirt a deep, wet crimson. But despite the agony radiating through his body, a dark, grim, victorious smile pulled at the corners of his mouth. "I run a mercantile, Emerson," Amos rasped, his gravelly voice strained but utterly triumphant. "I don't sell dynamite, I sell hardware." Emerson felt all the blood drain from his face, replaced by a sickening, paralyzing wave of vertigo. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. The Colt revolver slipped from his numb fingers, hitting the sand with a dull thud. They hadn't been trapped by a mountain-leveling explosive. They hadn't been held hostage by a dead man's switch. They had been held hostage by their own paranoia, their own crushing guilt, and the sheer, immovable willpower of a man who simply did not care if he lived or died. The great Emerson Blackwood, the terror of the territory, had allowed his entire gang to be systematically dismantled, his men crippled and killed, all because he was terrified of a box of old horseshoes. "You," Emerson stammered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, reedy whisper. He fell to his knees in the dirt, staring blankly at the iron. "You broke us? With horseshoes?" "I broke you," Amos corrected, spitting a wad of blood onto the sand, his pale eyes burning into Emerson's soul, "by letting you look in the mirror. You were so convinced of your own violent nature. You couldn't imagine a world where another man wouldn't just blow us all to hell." Behind them, the rhythmic thunder of hooves grew deafening. The golden, flickering glow of a dozen kerosene lanterns rounded the bend at the mouth of Cutter's Pass, piercing the darkness and throwing long beams of light across the wreckage of the Blackwood gang. The law had arrived, and Emerson had absolutely nothing left to fight them with. The wind howling through the narrow stone chute of Cutter's Pass was suddenly swallowed by a sound that Emerson Blackwood had spent 5 bloody years successfully outrunning. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration in the sandy floor, a deep tremor that vibrated through the soles of his boots. Within seconds, it crescendoed into the deafening, thunderous roar of heavily shod hooves striking hard earth and loose rock. The law had not just caught up to the Blackwood gang. It was about to run them into the ground. Around the jagged, shadowed bend at the northern mouth of the canyon, a blinding constellation of golden light pierced the freezing desert gloom. A dozen kerosene lanterns swung wildly from the saddles of the approaching riders, casting long, monstrous, dancing shadows against the sheer sandstone walls. There were at least 20 men in the posse, riding hard, their horses lathered in white sweat despite the plummeting nighttime temperature. riding at the absolute vanguard of the column, sitting tall and rigid in the saddle of a massive roan stallion, was the legendary chief detective of Wells Fargo, Jim Hume. He was a man carved from the very granite of the frontier, sporting a thick walrus mustache and a heavy canvas coat lined with sheepskin. Across his lap rested a short-barreled, 10-gauge, double-barreled shotgun, a weapon that had ended the careers of a dozen stage robbers before Emerson had ever pulled his first heist. Flanking him were seasoned federal deputies and Pinkerton men, their Winchester rifles already levered and braced against their shoulders. "Hold your fire! Posse up! Posse up!" Hume's voice boomed like a cannon shot, echoing off the high canyon walls and momentarily drowning out the panicked whinnies of the horses. The lawmen reined in their mounts violently, kicking up a massive, choking cloud of white alkali dust that drifted through the lantern light like thick fog. They formed a heavily armed semicircle around the macabre tableau of the canyon floor. The heavy, metallic, synchronized click-clack of a dozen rifle hammers being pulled back in unison was the most terrifying sound Emerson had ever heard. It was the sound of absolute finality. "Drop every piece of iron you have, Blackwood!" Hume roared, raising the heavy shotgun and leveling the twin, cavernous muzzles directly at Emerson's chest. "You flinch, you breathe too hard, and I will cut you in half and leave what's left for the buzzards." Emerson Blackwood, the undisputed king of the Arizona alkali, the mastermind who had terrified the territory for half a decade, did not reach for his hidden derringer. He did not attempt a desperate, blazing last stand. He was already a hollowed-out shell, his spirit utterly broken by the absurdity of the pile of rusted iron resting by his boots. Emerson slowly, mechanically, raised his trembling hands high into the cold air. He sank to his knees in the blood-soaked sand, intertwining his fingers behind his head. The fight had been completely excised from his soul. "Move in! Secure them!" Hume barked, keeping his shotgun perfectly still. The posse dismounted in a rush of leather and jingling spurs. 4 deputies swarmed Emerson, seizing him with violent, unforgiving hands. They dragged him forward, kicking his boots out from under him, so he lay flat on his stomach in the dirt. The cold, heavy steel of iron shackles ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting painfully into his skin. Other deputies fanned out across the scene, their lanterns illuminating the devastating handiwork of the lone toll collector. They found Billy Caldwell lying stiff in the dust, a dark pool of congealed blood beneath his head, his lifeless eyes staring up at the narrow strip of starry sky. They found Josiah Boone, the terrifying, hulking brute, reduced to a whimpering, pathetic mess, bleeding profusely from a shattered kneecap and a ruined shoulder. Josiah spat curses at the deputies, but he lacked the strength to even swat their hands away as they confiscated his weapons and bound his good arm to his waist. And then there was Elias Trent. The older man was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and rattling. 3 deputies had to fetch a pair of heavy wooden fence posts from a pack mule, using them as makeshift levers to pry the 2,000-pound carcass of the dead draft horse off Elias's pulverized right leg. Elias let out one final, agonizing shriek as the weight shifted, before his eyes rolled back and he passed out from the shock. Jim Hume slowly dismounted, handing the reins of his roan to a nearby deputy. He kept his shotgun tucked under his arm as he walked through the wreckage. He noted the canvas sacks of gold eagle coins, $30,000 worth of territorial payroll, ripped open and scattered carelessly across the sand like worthless tin tokens. But what drew the old detective's attention was the shattered wooden crate labeled Hercules Powder Co., and the man slumped against the canyon wall beside it. Hume approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel. He raised his lantern, throwing a circle of yellow light over the scene. He looked at the shattered crate. He looked at the heavy, rusted cast-iron horseshoes spilling out of it. He looked up at the canyon walls. Following the thin black lines wedged into the rock's lines, he immediately recognized not as deck cord, but as cheap, black-tarred hemp rope used for tying down wagon tarps. Hume's hard, weathered face contorted in absolute bewilderment. He looked from the horseshoes down to Emerson Blackwood, who was being hauled to his feet by 2 deputies. "Blackwood," Hume said, his voice dropping from a booming command to a tone of profound, mocking disbelief. "Did you boys surrender to a box of damn horseshoes?" Emerson closed his eyes, his jaw trembling. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The snickers and low murmurs of disbelief from the surrounding deputies felt worse than a bullet. The public humiliation was absolute. Hume shook his head slowly, letting out a breath that plumed in the freezing air. He turned his attention to the man sitting against the wall. The stranger was clutching his left shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers and staining his dusty duster coat a deep, wet crimson. The man was pale, his breathing ragged, but his pale blue eyes were clear and unflinching. Hume stepped closer, lowering the lantern to illuminate the man's face. The detective squinted, his brow furrowing as recognition slowly dawned on him. "Good God Almighty," Hume whispered, lowering his shotgun so the barrels pointed at the dirt. "Amos? Amos Sterling? The mercantile owner from Prescott?" Amos Sterling offered a weak, tight-lipped nod. He didn't attempt to stand "Evening, Marshal Hume." "It's a cold night for a ride." Hume stared at the shopkeeper, struggling to reconcile the mild-mannered man who sold flour and nails with the architect of this brutal, psychological masterpiece. "Amos, what in the hell are you doing out here?" The dispatch said a federal payroll was hit. We tracked the mud wagon's blood trail for 3 hours. We expected to find an army of outlaws, not you sitting on a pile of rusted iron. "They needed to be stopped, Jim," Amos said quietly, his gravelly voice fighting through the pain of the gunshot wound. 3 years ago they came through Prescott. "That big one over there." Amos nodded toward the groaning Josiah. He put a shotgun slug through the chest of Phoenix Penhaligon. "Phoenix was my clerk. He was 19. He was a good boy." Hume sighed heavily, the pieces clicking into place. "I remember the Prescott job, Amos. I remember the boy. But taking on the Blackwood gang alone, with a bluff? You could have been butchered. You caught a bullet as it is." "I sold Phoenix the pocket watch he was carrying when he died," Amos replied, his eyes drifting toward the scattering of gold eagles in the dirt. "I watched him bleed out. And I watched this territory let these animals ride away because catching them was too expensive. I didn't care if I got butchered, Jim. I just cared that they didn't get to ride through this pass." Amos coughed, wincing as the movement jarred his torn shoulder. "The gold is all there, Marshal, and the toll has been paid in full." Hume looked at the grieving hardware clerk for a long, silent moment. The old detective had spent his life chasing desperate men, but he had never witnessed a display of raw, suicidal courage quite like this. "Doc!" Hume bellowed over his shoulder, his voice echoing sharply. "Get over here with your bag. Patch up Mr. Sterling's shoulder. Give him whiskey for the pain. And fetch my spare horse. He rides back with us, under my personal protection." As the territory doctor rushed forward with bandages and a flask, the deputies began the arduous process of loading the prisoners. Josiah was thrown roughly over the back of a pack mule, his wounded arm bound tight. Elias was strapped to a makeshift travois, still unconscious, his leg a mangled ruin. Emerson Blackwood was hoisted into the saddle of his own dark bay gelding. His ankles were tied tightly beneath the horse's belly, and the reins were handed to a Pinkerton detective. As the posse prepared to move out, turning their horses back toward the northern mouth of the pass, Emerson twisted awkwardly in his saddle to look back one final time. The lanterns were moving away, plunging the canyon floor back into deep, impenetrable shadows. Amos Sterling was sitting calmly while the doctor rapped his shoulder, entirely indifferent to the stolen gold being shoveled back into canvas sacks by the lawmen. Emerson turned his face forward, the freezing desert wind biting into his cheeks. The realization settled over him with the crushing weight of an iron vault. He was going to Yuma Territorial Prison. He was going to face the hangman's noose, but the worst punishment of all was the legacy he was leaving behind. He wouldn't be remembered as the brilliant strategist who stole $30,000 in eagle coins. He wouldn't be immortalized in dime novels as the ruthless king of the alkali, who went down in a blazing storm of gunfire against the legendary Jim Hume. No, History would remember Emerson Blackwood as the fool who threw down his guns, surrendered his gold, and let his gang be destroyed because he was outnerved and outplayed by a grieving shopkeeper holding nothing but a box of rusted horseshoes. The Blackwood gang was dead, and as the posse rode out of the canyon, leaving the desert wind to sweep the alkali dust over the blood and the scattered iron, Emerson Blackwood knew that his legend had died right alongside it. The legend of the Blackwood gang ended not with a glorious last stand against the cavalry, but in the freezing dust of Cutter's Pass, dismantled by the sheer, unyielding willpower of a grieving shopkeeper. Amos proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the Wild West wasn't a fast draw or a stick of dynamite, but a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. If this gritty tale of revenge, psychological warfare, and frontier justice kept you on the edge of your seat, be sure to hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten legends to life. Share this story with your friends who love a good twist. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the untamed West. What would you have done in Emerson's boots? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you on the next trail.